And turning now to another major developing story here. Just moments ago, we learned the two former Horry County deputies accused of causing the deaths of two mental health patients will be tried separately. Right now, the trial of Stephen Flood is underway in Marion County. Investigators say he drove around a barrier and into floodwaters during Hurricane Florence. While Patrick Lloyd is live in Marion County this afternoon. And Patrick, you've been inside the courtroom. What's happened so far?
The trial not officially underway yet, just jury selection, but that does not mean that there has not been a handful of notable moments to happen in the courtroom this morning. The first of which, of course, is what you mentioned, that Stephen Flood and Joshua Bishop will be tried separately, and this trial is solely for Stephen Flood. Joshua Bishop will be tried separately at a later date. Now, something to note here is that the attorneys and the judge really have their work cut out for them in this case when it comes to picking a jury for this case, and that of course is because this case has received so much media attention. There was a point this morning during jury selection when Judge William Seals asked all of the potential jurors whether they had heard of this case after he gave a brief description of it, whether it was through media, social media, word of mouth, or any way at all. More than half of the potential jurors who were remaining at the time stood up, indicating that yes, they had heard of the case, and the judge as well as the attorneys had to speak individually with each one of those potential jurors to make sure that they can choose people who are going to be unbiased in this case. So that is something to keep an eye on for this jury selection portion of the trial. Also something to note here is that the judge listed off the list of witnesses for both the prosecution and the defense. One of the defense witnesses is Joshua Bishop, so it's certainly possible that we could see him testify here at this trial at some point. Another thing to keep an eye on as jury selection continues and this trial continues throughout the week. Of course, we're going to bring you coverage on it as it all happens. Reporting live in Marion County this afternoon, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
We are also following breaking news out of Marion County for you this afternoon. The trial of one of the ex-Horry County deputies charged in the deaths of two mental health patients is underway. Stephen Flood faces 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of reckless homicide as well. Patrick Lloyd has been following the case since it happened. So, Patrick, tell us what happened in court so far today.
Yeah, Eric, jury selection got underway this morning, as is standard with most trials, all trials in fact, and that jury selection process actually went by pretty quickly, as by 2:30 the trial was officially underway. Of course, opening statements took place, and the first witness on the stand this afternoon in Stephen Flood's trial was Sergeant Elizabeth Orlando with the Horry County Sheriff's Office. She's the supervisor who oversees transportation at the Horry County Sheriff's Office. She was able to talk about a meeting that took place prior to Stephen Flood and Joshua Bishop taking both Wendy Newton and Nicolette Green out into that jail transport van and into Marion County. That, of course, is just the first witness of many witnesses in this case. The witness list that was described prior to the trial's start is a lengthy one. We do know also on that witness list is Joshua Bishop, the other man charged in this case, who of course is not standing trial this week, that he will be tried separately at a later date, and we will continue to keep you updated on this trial as it continues to move throughout the week. We expect it to last throughout several days this week, so we will bring you all of the updates as they come into the newsroom. Live in Marion County, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
Meanwhile, the trial of Stephen Flood, the deputy charged in the drowning deaths of 2 mental health patients, continues today. It's still going on as we speak at the Marion County Courthouse. And that's where we find our own Patrick Lloyd, who's been covering this case from the very start. So Patrick, can you tell us what's happened so far today?
Yeah, Rachel, while yesterday's primary focus in the trial was what happened prior to the transport of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton, today's primary focus of the trial has been what happened during the transport of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton. We heard from 2 witnesses today who were also Horry County Sheriff's Office deputies who worked in the transportation division. They transported mental health patients, and those deputies were deputies Latifia Witherspoon and Bruce Crawford. Now, they testified that they also took part in a separate transport of a mental health patient on September 18th, 2018, of course the same day Green and Newton died. Witherspoon and Crawford testified that during their transport, they also came across a flooded road that was blocked by a barricade. However, they, unlike Stephen Flood, backed up and ended up taking a different route. So clearly the prosecution here trying to paint the picture that Stephen Flood had more than one opportunity here to get the patients to safety, they are illustrating the fact that other deputies were in the exact same situation as Stephen Flood and Joshua Bishop, but they ended up taking the safe route, which of course was backing up and turning around, finding a different route for the transport of those mental health patients. Now, like Rachel mentioned, the trial is still going on as we speak. We're live streaming it right now on the WMBF News app and on the WMBF News Facebook page, so be sure to head on over there to catch every single second of the trial as it all happens. We're live in Marion. Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
Our other top story tonight, the trial for the former Horry County deputy charged in the deaths of 2 mental health patients is close to reaching the end of day 2.
Stephen Flood is charged with a reckless homicide and involuntary manslaughter in connection to the deaths of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton.
And our Patrick Lloyd was there the day of that incident in Marion County, and he's followed this case every step of the way.
Yeah, Patrick joins us live now outside that courthouse. What have you learned today, Patrick?
Well, Eric and Rachel, good evening. We actually just learned moments ago the jury was dismissed for the day, so day 2 of the trial of Stephen Flood is now in the books, and today's testimony really painted a clearer picture for the jury of what exactly happened on September 18th of 2018. We heard testimony from several witnesses who work in law enforcement today who were at the site of the incident, and they described what they saw when they arrived to help out. One of the witnesses was Will Duncan with SLED. Now, during Duncan's testimony, Solicitor Ed Clements showed the jury photos of the scene Duncan took. Those photos were out of the view of our camera, but I was able to move over a little bit to see them, and they really just captured how serious what happened was. You could see in those photos just how extremely flooded the road was, and you could just barely see the top of the van after it was overcome with floodwaters. And another witness was a game warden with SCDNR at the time. He testified about the flooded conditions of the road. When Clements asked that game warden whether he would drive down Highway 76 on that day based on seeing those flooded road conditions, his response was simply, "No, sir, not a chance." Live in Marion County tonight, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
Day 2 of the trial of Stephen Flood is now in the books.
Flood is one of the 2 ex-deputies charged in the deaths of mental health patients Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton.
Patrick Lloyd's been covering this case from day 1. He's covering the trial for us all week, in fact.
And Patrick joins us live now outside the Marion County Courthouse with a recap of day 2 of that trial. So Patrick, what can you tell us?
Eric, Rachel, a lot of the testimony we heard today was from law enforcement officials who were on Highway 76 patrolling who was and was not allowed to go around the flood barrier. Stephen Flood ended up going around himself. Zachary Eskew was one of the main witnesses we heard from today. He was a member of the National Guard at the time of the incident. Now, he testified that he spoke with Stephen Flood before he went around the flood barrier, and he testified that Flood told him he wanted to go around the barrier to see how the road was looking. He also said Flood did not mention he was transporting mental health patients. Eskew testified that he was told by his superiors that he needed to let official vehicles go through, which is why he allowed Flood to drive past the barricade. Eskew also testified that he tried earlier that day to drive his massive military truck through the water on that road, but he had to actually turn around because the water got too high. Now, Eskew is a big witness in this case because even though there were lots of law enforcement officials there patrolling who was and was not allowed to go around that flood barrier on Highway 76, Eskew was the only one who actually spoke with Flood prior to Flood going around that barrier, which means he's the only one who knows why, according to Flood, he went around that flood barrier. He's also a big witness in this case because the defense will likely, in closing arguments, point to this testimony and say that Flood only made the decision to go around that flood barrier because he was allowed to by Eskew. They might likely argue that Eskew could have prevented all of this from actually happening. Of course, the prosecution might come back with that in their closing argument, saying that Eskew, of course, was only following the orders he was given, which again was to allow all official vehicles through. We're live tonight in Marion. Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
First and for the trial of the ex-deputy accused in the deaths of 2 mental health patients. It's now in its 3rd day. The jury heard from several more witnesses today, most of whom were law enforcement authorities. Patrick Lloyd, covering this case since the beginning, joins us live in front of the Marion County Courthouse now. Patrick, good afternoon.
Eric, good afternoon. And the state is very close to resting its case here in this trial, because currently the final witness on the state's witness list is being cross-examined by the defense, so we are expecting the state to rest its case probably today, sometime soon. We also expect anyway the defense's case to not last that long, considering the fact that a lot of the witnesses on the defense's witness list are overlaps of the state's witness list as well. Now, the most notable moment of today, and really the most notable moment of the entire trial, centered around drone video. You heard Eric mention the prosecution played for the jury today. Before the jury saw that video, the defense actually tried to prevent the prosecution from showing it to them by arguing that the water levels shown in that video are much different than they were at the time Flood drove into the floodwater, because the video shows the rescue and recovery efforts. Solicitor Ed Clements, of course, counter-argued that the drone video was the most relevant piece of evidence in this entire case. Now, the judge ultimately did allow the video to be shown, and that video was shown on a TV screen in the courtroom that was shown to the jury at an angle that our camera inside the courtroom could not capture, but I was able to kind of walk around and take a look at the drone video myself, and I will say it is very dramatic video. It shows first responders on top of the van using an axe to try to cut the top of the van open to get those mental health patients out. Of course, we know that they were not able to do that successfully, and Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton are not here today as a result of that. We, of course, will continue to bring you more coverage on this trial, as again, the state is likely to wrap up its case and rest its case just moments from now. Live in Marion, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News. The state has rested its case, so the prosecution done presenting its case to the jury today, and the jury has been dismissed for the day. So tomorrow, of course, the defense will present its case. Now, today's testimony was filled with lots of testimony from law enforcement officials, as was the case yesterday. One of those law enforcement officials we heard from was a employee of the Horry County Sheriff's Office who was assigned to monitor the radio activity among deputies, and she spoke with Joshua Bishop on September 18th, 2018. Now, that employee I'm speaking about was Hannah Berghard, and she spoke with the prosecution and defense today about what the conversation she had with Bishop while Bishop and Flood were dealing with the flooded van was about. She testified that every deputy has an emergency button on their radio that allows their location to be shown to other deputies, but she testified Bishop's button on his radio didn't show his location after he pressed that button. She also testified about the moment it became clear that Green and Newton likely did not make it.
At 1859, Bishop said to be advised that he could no longer hear the females anymore.
And that moment you just heard there was a rather unique moment in this trial, because, as I mentioned, a lot of the testimony has been from law enforcement officials, so a lot of their testimony has been very fact-based, not very emotion-driven, but you kind of heard Berghard's voice there start to crack there toward the end of that sentence. You could tell that it was an emotional moment, not just for her, but also for the families of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton in the courtroom. You could kind of hear them be a little bit emotionally distressed after hearing that piece of information. So again, the latest here in the trial of Stephen Flood, the prosecution has rested its case. Tomorrow, we will hear from the defense. Live in Marion, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
And we turn now to another story we've been following all week. Day 3 of the testimony in the trial of Stephen Flood is in the books. And today, the prosecution rested its case.
Flood is the ex-Horry County deputy charged in the drowning deaths of 2 mental health patients after authorities say he drove a van into floodwaters. Patrick Lloyd has followed this case since the day the incident happened.
And he joins us live now outside the Marion County Courthouse. Hey, Patrick, what did you learn today?
Well, Eric and Rachel, as you mentioned, the prosecution rested its case today, so a big day in this trial. So now the focus turns to tomorrow, when the defense will start to present its case. Today, however, though, was another eventful day of testimony here in the trial of Stephen Flood. We heard from several different people who work in law enforcement and who worked in law enforcement at the time of the incident, including 2 Horry County Fire Rescue employees who shot drone video of the rescue and recovery efforts on top of the van. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that video for you since it was shown at an angle away from our camera, but I did see it. I was able to step away off to the side, and it was dramatic and intense for sure. We also heard from Stephen Howell from SLED. He investigated the case. At one point during his cross-examination, Flood's attorney, Jarrett Bouchette, asked Howell about the fact that the deputies weren't able to open the back of the van since they didn't have the keys. Here's part of that exchange.
It doesn't have anything to do with him making the decision to drive into those waters. The design of the van has nothing to do with him deciding to drive into all that water.
This is a case about their death. I'm asking you about their death. It had something to do with the reason they died, correct?
And their death was a result of him driving into that water.
And as for tomorrow, of course, we know the defense will start to present its case. As I mentioned earlier, the witness list for the defense is much shorter than the witness list for the prosecution, so we're expecting the defense to go through their case a lot quicker than the prosecution did. Among the witnesses on the witness list is Joshua Bishop, so we are expecting to hear him testify tomorrow. It's unclear as of right now, though, whether Stephen Flood will testify in his own defense. That's something the judge spoke with him about at the end of court today, encouraging him to sleep on it, think about it overnight, and make a decision when he comes tomorrow. Live in Marion, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
Live, local, now. WMBF starts with breaking news.
And we have breaking news. A jury has found former Horry County Deputy Stephen Flood guilty on all counts. He's convicted of 2 counts of reckless homicide and 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. This is in connection to the drowning deaths of 2 mental health patients, Wendy Newton and Nicolette Green. Flood drove around road barriers and into flood waters caused by Hurricane Florence while transporting Green and Newton in September 2018. Our Patrick Lloyd has been covering this incident since it happened nearly 4 years ago, and he's live right now in Marion County where that trial just wrapped up. Patrick, certainly an emotional day for Green and Newton's families.
Yeah, Rachel, really an emotional day for just about everybody in the courtroom today. Like you mentioned, the families of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton obviously going through so much this week. Yes, they did end up getting the verdict that they wanted, guilty on all 4 counts. However, of course, just a terribly emotional week this week for them, having to relive the horrific incidents that ended up leading up to the deaths of their loved ones. And then on the other hand, you have the family of Stephen Flood, who was very emotional today as well, as they likely will not see their loved one, Stephen Flood, outside of a prison for the next 18 years, as that is what a judge ended up sentencing Flood to. Now, the defense did not present a case today in court, and that is because the defense said that the witnesses who had already testified were the witnesses they would have called themselves, so there was nobody to testify for them who hadn't already testified in the trial, and Stephen Flood chose not to take the stand himself. Closing arguments took place this morning, and the jury deliberated for just under 3.5 hours. After the guilty verdict was read, family members of Green and Newton had the chance to speak. Here's some of what Green's mother, Linda, said.
No matter what happens with this trial or the outcome, she is forever going to be missing in my life and in my family's life. I'll never see that incredible smile again. We will never sit at a table and have a meal together again. There won't be any more hugs or kisses ever again.
Now, Flood did speak briefly after the victim impact statements. He apologized for what happened, and he also called what happened a series of mistakes. Live in Marion, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
A jury found the former Horry County deputy accused in the drowning deaths of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton guilty on all counts today. The judge then sentenced Stephen Flood to 18 years in prison. Our very own Patrick Lloyd has followed this case for nearly 4 years now, and he joins us live now outside the Marion County Courthouse. So, Patrick, how are those families feeling now in light of that verdict and the sentencing?
Well, Rachel, this is exactly what they were hoping for. Guilty on all 4 counts and a heavy sentence from the judge. Wendy Newton's son, Charles, tells me he believes justice has been served. Now, the judge imposed the maximum sentence on both counts of involuntary manslaughter, 5 years each for those sentences, and he imposed a 4-year sentence for each count of reckless homicide. The maximum sentence for those charges would have been 10 years each. So the maximum sentence overall Flood was potentially facing going in was 30 years. He ends up now with 18 years behind bars. Now, after the jury reached the guilty verdict, the families of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton had the chance to speak to the judge before he handed down his sentence. Here's some of what Newton's son Charles had to say.
I'm not going to sit up here and drill you, Mr. Flood, and tell you how much I dislike/hate you. But I will say some of my family members will never forgive you. But I cannot live with a grudge in my heart, so I will say I do forgive you for the decisions you made that caused the death of my mom. But I will never forget.
So a very powerful moment there from Wendy Newton's son, Charles, forgiving Stephen Flood for the actions he took that ultimately led up to the death of his mother and Nicolette Green. And Charles was not the only family member of Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton who forgave Flood. Danella Green Johnson, Nicolette Green's sister, also forgave Flood. Live in Marion tonight, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.
Live, local, now. WMBF starts with breaking news.
We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant, Stephen William Flood, guilty.
That was the verdict read aloud 4 times in front of former Horry County Deputy Stephen Flood during his trial just hours ago. A jury convicted him of 2 counts of reckless homicide and 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter.
Yeah, this is in connection to the death of 2 mental health patients, Wendy Newton and Nicolette Green. Flood also learned he'd spend the next 18 years in prison. Patrick Lloyd was there the day the van got swept away by those floodwaters and followed this case for us every step of the way.
Yeah, Patrick joins us now live outside the Marion County Courthouse. So Patrick, this is really exactly what those victims' families were hoping for.
Rachel, Eric, you're right. That's exactly what they were hoping for. Nicolette Green's sister tells me she's surprised but satisfied with the outcome today. And Wendy Newton's son tells me he believes justice has been served. Now, I want you to take a look at this video here, some powerful video to show you after the trial was over here, a special moment of prayer shared between Nicolette Green's mother, Linda, and a pastor who came to support the families of the victims. A very emotional moment, and there were many emotional moments inside the courthouse today as well, most notably the victim impact statements members of Green and Newton's families read. Here's some of what Green's sister, Danella Green Johnson, said.
This was a deliberate act set in motion by a pompous, stubborn man who was supposed to be a trained professional. He swore to serve and protect. Instead, he abused the trust that my sister Nikki, Wendy, and state of South Carolina entrusted him with. And why? For what? To save some time?
Flood was taken into handcuffs after the judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison, and he had the chance to say goodbye to his family. Before that, though, Flood briefly spoke. Here's some of what he said.
I never, ever intended to do anything to make this happen the way it did. It was a series of mistakes on my part and other people that led me to that point in time and day.
So again, Stephen Flood sentenced to 18 years behind bars. Meanwhile, still no word on when the trial of Joshua Bishop, the other deputy inside the van at the time of the incident, will take place. Live in Marion tonight, Patrick Lloyd, WMBF News.